Thanks for tuning in to the Dinosaurs Lately podcast, the dinosaur podcast that features periodic updates recapping the latest news on the dinosaurs. My name's Ryan Rogers, and this is the podcast that targets a type of dinosaur and tries to catch you up on everything that's been published on them lately. Welcome to the 8th of these interstitial episodes I've created to keep up with all the dinosaur news, even while I'm not publishing new episodes of the Juras-Sick Park-Cast. And I hope it helps you feel more up to date. Welcome to episode 8, Hadrosauroids, part 1, recorded January 27th, 2026. A continued thank you to Christoph Oakes of Snail, S-N-A-L-E. Check out his incredible albums on Spotify and Bandcamp. Snail's third album is out now. You can find it too on Spotify and Bandcamp. It's called, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, Toy and Bee. And I've been playing it endlessly because it's super catchy. And there's lots of fun new tracks to get stuck in your head. Today's intro is Black Coffee from the album Charlemagne, and the outro is T-shirts from Snail's self-titled debut album, Snail. 3 things before we get into the thick of things. First, I put together a little PDF on ankylosaurs. If you'd like a copy, just send me an email and I'll forward it over to you, no charge. It literally costs you nothing to drop me a line and ask for it, ryansrogers@gmail.com. Second, if you'd like to request a particular family of dinosaurs to cover for an upcoming episode, please do. I've got an informal schedule I'm keeping, but I can take requests. Third, the last few episodes have been really long, so I've divided this one up to be more bite-sized. If you prefer it this way, let me know. Just a quick email that's like, yep, breaking it up was way better. Something like that. I look forward to hearing from you. In today's episode, which nobody asked for, we're catching up on Hadrosauroids. So let's get started. First, we'll recall that hadrosaurs are the conventionally named duck-billed dinosaurs, which you can imagine being big with fat tails, stout hind limbs, smaller forelimbs, and flat billed beaks at the front of their skulls, and some had fancy crests and protrusions on their heads. And you can think of the famous Parasaurolophus and its big head crest, or Corythosaurus with its big helmet-like crest, and Maiasaurus is famous for its strange combination of protrusions and crests at the same time. Hadrosaurids are a bit more general than hadrosaurids, in that they're generally the shape of a hadrosaur, but include basal members which aren't yet diagnostically distinct hadrosaurs, and instead are ancestors of hadrosaurs, and belong to a more basal proper family called Iguanodonts, sort of. Hadrosauroids were basically big quadrupedal herbivores from the late Cretaceous. If you've got a hadrosaur, you've got a late Cretaceous animal. They weren't around before that. In the early Cretaceous, you basically had iguanodontids. Very generally speaking, Iguanodon is famous for also being big and quadrupedal, but had no crests. And rather than a flat-billed beak, they had a sharp beak, and of course, the famous thumb spikes. Generally speaking, Iguanodon-like animals were spread all over the globe in the early Cretaceous, evolving into the hadrosaurs that were also all over the globe by the late Cretaceous. What they also share in common are incredible adaptations in herbivorous food processing. Their grinding teeth are exceptional food masticating factories, which is very different from the ankylosaurs and sauropods we've discussed, which relied on gastroliths to process their food in their guts. That doesn't appear to be how these more advanced ornithischians were digesting their food. Now, I like to start as basally on the branch as possible and progress forwards through the millennia when going through these news updates. And given what I've just said about the Hadrosauroids, we know that if I start in the early Cretaceous, we're talking about a very basal member of the family tree that's not yet a Hadrosauroid, and that's true. Hadrosauroids constitute a diverse clade of ornithopod dinosaurs identified by their complex dental battery and conspicuous cranial crests. They've been identified from North and South America, Europe, Asia, Antarctica, and Africa in sediments belonging to the Upper Cretaceous, which is the Campanian and Maastrichtian eras, spanning from 84 to 66 million years ago. And the record includes 98 species and 85 genera, with 45 species recorded for the American continent. So this episode's first article dates way back to before Hadrosaurus, called A Reassessment of the Historical Fossil Findings from Bahia State, northeast of Brazil, reveals a diversified dinosaur fauna in the lower Cretaceous of South America, published in Historical Biology in April 2024. This paper rediscovered some fossils at the British Museum of Natural History that were collected between 1859 and 1906, and since, quote, remained undescribed and most were considered lost. What is most exciting is that these were some of the first ever collected fossils from South America. When they were rediscovered in collection, it became an opportunity to revisit them after 160 years. The specimens are from 5 different sites from the early Cretaceous of northeastern Brazil. Quote, this study confirms the presence of Ornithischian dinosaurs in Brazil, expanding their biogeographic and temporal range before the continental rifting between South America and Africa. Recall, Allosaurus and Brachiosaurus species are known from the US, Africa, and Europe, indicating that in the late Jurassic, these continents were connected, but by the early Cretaceous, they had begun splitting apart, most notably between the northern and southern sections, leaving Laurasia in the north and Gondwana in the south. The Ornithischians of Cretaceous Brazil are, quote, scarce and most of them doubtful, say the authors. They are just chunks and bits, like a, quote, putative Iguanodontian centra and a, quote, Ornithischian ischium, later interpreted as a spinosaur rib, and a, quote, partial caudal vertebra. But by describing these fossils, they hope to, quote, encourage Brazilian paleontologists to conduct further fieldwork in the basins of Bahia State, as they represent one of the earliest Cretaceous faunas in South America and indicates potential new important discoveries. Among these sparsely represented ornithischians is a very early hadrosauroid ancestor they named Tietosaura derbiana. The authors ran the materials through the phylogenetic analysis machine and found that Tietosaura is an advanced ornithopod of the Elasmaria type, which are South American or Gondwanan basal iguanodonts that have mineralized plates on their ribs. Tieta honors the main character from the novel Tieta do Agreste by Jorge Amando, who was born in Bahia, and Sora is Greek for lizard, and Derbiana honors Orville A. Derby, a founder and the first director from the Brazilian Mineral and Geological Commission, making this Tieta's lizard for Orville Derby. And obviously the name honors the Brazilian geology, minerals, and culture as well. So that's a neat name. The holotype NHMPVR 3424, housed at the Natural History Museum of London, was uncovered from a beach associated with the Marfim Formation. It's comprised of the distal half of a small femur, which isn't much to go on. Tietosaura was only distantly related to Hadrosaurs, but as part of this Brazilian dinosaur fauna, the authors say, quote, in a broad perspective, the dinosaur fauna from Recôncavo Basin also exhibits striking similarities with African dinosaur faunas from the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary. Quote, the specimens described in this study hold historical significance as they represent the first dinosaur bones collected from South America. They highlight the fossiliferous potential of the Cretaceous deposits in Bahia State, which have been relatively unexplored since their initial discoveries. All right, that's the only story I had from the early Cretaceous, obviously because we're talking about Hadrosauroids, and there are no early Cretaceous Hadrosauroids. So in the late Cretaceous, 50 million years later in the Cenomanian age, about 85 million years ago, we have the subject of our next article entitled Neonatal State and Degree of Necessity for Parental Care in Maiasaura based on the inferred neonatal metabolic rates in the journal Scientific Reports from July 2025. In this article, the authors inferred, quote, the neonatal metabolic rate at rest, the RMR, and a maximum activity level, MMR, of the hadrosaurid dinosaur Maiasaura pebblesaurum from the Two Medicine Formation of Montana using phylogenetic eigenvector maps. They investigated the locomotor and motor activity of the neonates by comparing the difference between maximum and minimum rates of oxygen consumption, which they say, when applied to Maiasaura, allowed for a, quote, quantitative assessment of its neonatal state and to deduce its dependence on parental care. They found that the neonatal metabolic rate at rest for Maiasaura is similar to those of present-day fast-growing endotherms or warm-blooded animals such as deer, waterfowl, mound-building birds, pheasants, seabirds, and ostriches, and not endotherms like monitors, crocodiles, and sea turtles. That said, the femoral sections showed, quote, a highly vascularized cortex suggesting a high oxygen supply at rest. The associated value is similar or higher than those of present-day birds and mammals, and differs from the avascular or almost avascular bone of present-day slow-growing ectotherms. They inferred a neonatal metabolic rate at rest value for M. pebblesaurum, which is, quote, is higher than that obtained in other studies for adult members of the species, and may be explained by the difference in ontogenetic stage, say the authors. Quote, mass-specific metabolic rates are expected to decrease with ontogeny, for instance, with the slowing of growth or the increasing of body mass. However, comparing mass-specific metabolic rate at rest values of specimens having the same ontogenetic stage reduces such bias and may avoid misinterpretation of their thermal physiology. So it's possible the metabolic rate of young or neonatal Maiasaurs was much, much higher than that of adults. Quote, these results show that neonate Maiasaura rely on aerobic power at rest for growth and maintenance like extant fast-growing endotherms. It is also consistent with previous histological studies that estimated a bird-like bone apposition rate in nestling Maiasaura pebblesaurum and in the juvenile Lambeosaurian hadrosaur Hypacrosaurus stebangeri. Their results also, quote, reject a varanid-like intermediate thermophysiology for hadrosaurs because monitors have relatively low bone vascularization associated with low oxygen consumption rate at rest. It is therefore more relevant to compare the Maiasaura values with the endotherm values than with the ectotherm values for inferring their neonatal state in their altricial precocial spectrum. That's their argument. Quote, this result is consistent with the previously proposed hypothesis of nidicolous, M. peoplesorum requiring perinatal care. This can be your word of the day, nidicolous, Nidicolous, nidicolous. So nidicolous is of a young bird or other animal like Maiasaura staying in the nest for a long time after birth. So there's your word. They further conclude, quote, finally, based on age estimations from M. peoplesorum neonate remains found both in and outside nest sites, we estimate that this species remained in the nest for approximately 40 to 75 days. Maiasaura provides a useful ecological baseline from which to infer neonatal states in other hadrosaurs of similar adult size. Hypacrosaurus stebingeri, whose differing ecological traits point to a relatively more precocial condition, or in other words, it might be able to leave the nest at a much younger age. They conclude, quote, Maiasaura peoplesorum was most likely altricial and needed intensive parental care such as feeding and protection for between 40 to 75 days. Using the Maiasaura data as a baseline has helped to consider how neonatal hatchlings of other similar-sized hadrosaurs may be interpreted. The authors say, quote, widespread post-hatching parental care in hadrosaurs deserves to be further tested and cannot be confirmed yet, but if their inferences are correct, it suggests that Hypacrosaurus stebingeri and Maiasaura peoplesorum, though both from the two medicine formation, show, quote, differences in terms of early growth dynamics, and that these differences offer the hypothesis that, quote, hadrosaur worldwide distribution and evolutionary success might be partly explained by a diversity of reproductive strategies, allowing them to live in and reproduce in contrasted environments during the late Cretaceous. The next article works to infer populations of extinct organisms through mathematical modeling proposals and generic parameters named First Population Analysis in Hadrosauroid Dinosaurs, published in Evolving Earth in January 2025. Based on hadrosauroid body mass, a mathematical model was built to infer their population densities. They admit using differential equations to infer paleobiological aspects is a field of research that's underexplored in Latin America, and in particular Mexico, and so they are offering it as an, quote, innovative proposal. They hope that they establish a strong link between mathematics and paleontology, and as a result offer a new field of opportunities for future research. With their modeling based on body mass estimates, the authors say they have inferred the minimum and maximum population per species and their optimal stable population. Obviously, different species had different estimated body masses. Mexican hadrosauroids like Huallasaurus, whose name is made up of Aztecan words meaning ancient duck, were estimated at 1,400 kilograms, whereas Magnapolia laticata was estimated at 9,800 kilograms. So Magnapolia is obviously very big, and also one of the largest hadrosaurs in North America. By the late Cretaceous, average adult hadrosauroids grew to between 23 and 33 feet long and weighed around 3,000 kilograms, which the authors note is supported by Mexican species like Villafrons quahuilensis, Laterinus, Huitzilani, and Tlatalophus gallorum. To put that in perspective, 3,000 kilograms is the weight of a full-size pickup truck. The density of Mexican hadrosauroids obtained through this work, through simulations, say the authors, considered food abundance, normal conditions, and low food productivity, enabling them to, quote, observe the changes in population in response to changes in food resources. This created 3 scenarios per species. Recall, they used the high, low, and just right food availability scenarios, the Goldilocks method, and they resulted in 3 scenarios per species, totaling 24 densities. Quote, the present work employs differential equations to infer paleobiological aspects, a field of research that is relatively underexplored in Latin America, particularly in Mexico. They conclude, it, quote, is therefore presented as an innovative proposal. This enables the establishment of a strong link between mathematics and paleontology, offering new field of opportunities for future research. What did they learn about Mexican hadrosauroid population densities? Quote, the possible coexistence of diverse species of hadrosauroids in the Cerro de Pueblo Formation, Coahuila, and the Campanian indicates high interactive complexity within the community during the Cretaceous, due to the diverse structural habitats and trophic guilds among hadrosauroids in the area, like Tlatalophus, Laterinus, Villafrons, and Quahuilasaurus. This will probably allow their coexistence. Moreover, possible niche partitioning can be inferred either by seasonal, sexual, or habitat differences, or through periodical seasonal movements and or stratigraphic differences, justifying possible sympatry, discarding the principle of competitive exclusivity as observed in modern species. And sympatry is when two or more species or populations living in the same geographic area allows them to interact and potentially interbreed. So perhaps this is a lifestyle Hadrosauroids in Mexico were living. Who knows? Maybe. The next article is Inside a Duck-Billed Dinosaur, Vertebral Bone Microstructure of Huallasaurus, published in the Journal of the Anatomical Record in August 2025. The Huallasaurus, you aren't obligated to know by heart, is like a 30-foot-long Cretaceous hadrosaur, which are the non-crested hadrosaurs that have what's often described as a Roman nose or aquiline nose. On the snout, the beak points down, and there are two enormous lengthy nares that stretch almost up to the eye socket. It kind of looks like a potato peeler on the bridge of your snout, and it had a regular old Ornithischian body you'd find on any other hadrosaur. Its name is the southern duck lizard, named in 2022 on fossils I believe were collected in 1984 and are housed at the Museo Argentino de Ciencias Naturales, Bernardino Rivadavia, from Rio Negro, Argentina, of the Maastrichtian age in the late Cretaceous. In any case, the authors performed a microanatomical analysis of the vertebrae of Huallasaurus australis to gain insights into the evolution of skeletal structure in Ornithischian dinosaurs and found the internal architecture of the axial skeleton exhibits an anematic trabecular matrix distributed throughout the centrum and neural arch, without signs of internal pneumatic chambers, contrasting sharply with the pneumatized condition characteristic of post-Carnian saurischians. In other words, the pneumaticity of bones comes up a lot when we hear about theropods and sauropods, which are the saurischians or lizard-hipped dinosaurs. It comes up a lot. It's a big part of their skeletal evolution. Theropods and sauropods relied on pneumaticity. This bone pneumaticity is connected to unique saurischian respiratory systems that enhanced ventilation, reduced body density, and possibly aided in the thermal regulation in larger organisms. But this study is investigating the other side of the dinosaur family tree, the Ornithischians. Quote, our observations reveal that the vertebral vascular pattern in Huallasaurus bears a notable resemblance to that of Silosaurus. Whether this similarity reflects deep phylogenetic relationships or convergent functional adaptations remains an open question that warrants further investigation. They're not outright saying that Silosaurus may be the ancestral form of Ornithischian dinosaurs, which is a hypothesis that's out there, but they are suggesting that, hey, here's another link between these animals. And granted, they are separated by 170 million years of evolution. The authors also described the, quote, remarkably thin cortical walls observed in Huallasaurus as bearing a, quote, superficial similarity to the vertebral architecture of large modern mammals, which often accommodate intraosseous fat deposits. In this, they're saying, while they do not find pneumaticity in the Huallasaurus bones, what they do find resembles what is found in large mammals. Large mammals, I've read, use intraosseous fat deposits in their bone marrow as energy reserves in times of need, such as during migration or fasting, as observed in northern elephant seals. The authors aren't directly making this link, but they're obviously including this in the paper as a reason why large ornithischians like Huallasaurus might have this type of bone structure. And they say as much, quote, while the functional implications of this condition in Huallasaurus remain speculative, it may represent a biomechanical or physiological adaptation associated with supporting large body size in an apneumatic skeleton. So, if they aren't pneumatic, which is so essential apparently in saurischians, the adaptation they do have, which resembles intraosseous fat deposits in their bone marrow, may also be an essential adaptation that ornithischians rely on. Quote, these conclusions should be regarded as preliminary. They are very clear to say. Quote, nonetheless, this study highlights the potential for vertebral microanatomy to inform broader questions about respiratory evolution, body mass adaptations, and phylogenetic relationships in ornithischians. All right, the next article I couldn't get my hands on, but the author was good enough to post a thread about it on X. So we can get the gist of it even if we can't get the PDF itself. Published in the journal Royal Society B, Biological Sciences in October 2025, is the article Disparate Feeding Mechanics Between Two Hadrosaurid Dinosaurs Support the Potential for Resource Partitioning. In this article, the authors compared Gripposaurus notabilis, another Cretaceous hadrosaur like the Huallasaurus earlier, and Corythosaurus cassarius, which you might remember as a hadrosaur that has the big, round, helmet-like crest above its eyes. The authors noticed that the Dinosaur Park Formation in Alberta, Canada, is well known for its diverse fossil assemblage preserving over a dozen species of large-bodied herbivorous dinosaurs. Quote, the high density of large herbivores has raised questions of how these animals were able to coexist and limit competition, leading to several studies investigating the potential for resource partitioning. Resource partitioning means that they weren't directly competing for resources, or, like in a Venn diagram, the resources they each wanted didn't overlap. Most of the time, this means they weren't nesting in the same places and not eating the same things. This study wanted to investigate the big hadrosaurs of the dinosaur park formation because, quote, hadrosaurids are of particular ecological significance because of their abundance, diversity, and complex feeding system. The authors used 3D muscle reconstructions and finite element analysis to evaluate the mechanical performance of the cranium and lower jaws of the Lamiasaurine Corythosaurus causarius and the contemporaneous Hadrosaurian Gripposaurus notabilis to test for the potential resource partitioning. Quote, we found Gripposaurus had a larger abductor muscle than similarly sized Corythosaurus, but the Corythosaurus had greater mechanical efficiency, resulting in similar bite forces for similarly sized animals. They add, quote, the cranium of Corythosaurus is more resistant to bending than Gripposaurus and exhibits a derived stress distribution that is probably associated with the supracranial crest. The authors conclude Gripposaurus would have been able to process tougher plant materials than Corythosaurus. So that might mean, and this is me giving examples, not the authors, that Gripposaurus might have eaten, for example, tougher pine needles, whereas Corythosaurus might be eating softer vegetation like leaves. However, that's not entirely what the authors are saying. Quote, resource partitioning between hadrosaurids was size mediated, where similarly sized animals had similar potential for food processing. Larger hadrosaurians had stronger bites than Lamiasaurians and likely had a wider diet breadth. They conclude, quote, size-mediated resource partitioning is common in modern systems, suggesting that although hadrosaurids, ceratopsids, and ankylosaurians were specialized for different plants, within-group partitioning was subtle and ecological signals cannot be found apart from size, which this study has identified. Quote, lastly, our results emphasize the importance of performing complete abductor muscle reconstructions when running finite element analyses. They note, quote, analyses that simplify muscle vectors to single points will possibly miss key data on functional performance. Sticking with saurolophines from the Campanian, our next article introduces a new animal just like that. From New Mexico, in the paper, a new saurolophine hadrosaur from the Upper Cretaceous Hunter Wash member, Kirtland Formation, San Juan Basin, New Mexico. Published in the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science Bulletin in September 2025. Named Aschisaurus womani. This new animal is about 35 feet long and was recovered from the Kirtland Formation of New Mexico. It is named after the Aschisaurus Wash Wilderness in the lower Hunter Wash member of the Kirtland Formation, which is itself named after the Navajo phrase meaning salt is gray, and Sauros is familiar to us as Greek for lizard, and the species name Womani honors Carl Wyman, making this Carl Wyman's Aschisaurus lizard. The holotype USNM VP8629 is housed at the United States National Museum of Natural History, which is part of the Smithsonian Institute, and it's comprised of a skull, several isolated cranial elements, including the right jugal, quadrate, dentary, and syringular, and a series of articulated cervical vertebrae. Now, the description says skull, but it's a partial skull, and that's fine. It was definitely enough for the authors to identify this and describe this, but not necessarily right away. The skull is incomplete, quote, missing the anterior end, including the premaxillae, nasals, lacrimals, and maxillae, which is the upper jaw, snout, and nose. However, the skull preserves many diagnostic bones, including the brain case, that can be directly compared to that of other hadrosaurids, especially to Cretaceous navajovius and Naashoibidosaurus ostromi. They add that the skull has, quote, a typical Cretaceous hadrosaurid morphology, which lacks the distinctive cranial ornamentation in the form of an elongated nasal tube-like structure present in the Lambeosaurian hadrosaurids such as Parasaurolophus. That said, it was briefly described as a Cretaceous navajovius, but the time gap between the dates for the rock formations is more than 2 million years apart, so they were not contemporary species. Quote, in addition to the holotype A. womani, several specimens from the same strata may belong to this newly identified species, including a well-preserved left dentary and a partial skeleton, as well as 2 humeri, one belonging to a large adult and the other to a juvenile. Their phylogenetic analysis also show that there might be some evolutionary specialization occurring on the Campanian shores of Laramidia. Quote, the skull of A. womani preserves several taxonomically informative characters that show close affinities with a stratigraphically younger Naashoibidosaurus ostromi from the Denazin member. Together with the Naashoibidosaurus, the Aschisaurus forms a potentially novel clade of flat-headed saurolophine hadrosaurids. This hypothesis continues to suggest that saurolophines were a taxonomically diverse group, which during the last 20 million years of the Cretaceous were among the dominant herbivorous dinosaurs in southern Laramidia, which is like Mexico today. The next article is kind of fun and weird at the same time, and it's also about footprints. The article, the holotypes Patagonicornis venetiorum and Tridigit ichnus in opinatus Vertebrate Ichnotaxa, History and Patronymial Significance, published in GeoHeritage in November 2025, describes how they reinvestigated some dinosaurian trackways that were published on decades ago. What makes this a strange story is the slabs that the trackways were reported on were used to make a sidewalk. The Argentinian Monton Hilo quarry, owned by Mr. Fernando Rodriguez, provided slabs to pave sidewalks, and in fact had used some of these slabs in his own driveway. In 1978, the Ligabu expedition noticed a track-bearing slab in the Rodriguez's sidewalk, which led it to be extracted and sent to a museum for further study. That slab was later donated to the Museo Civico di Venezia, now Museum di Storia Naturale di Venezia Giancarlo Ligabue in Venice, Italy. So this piece of sidewalk is now in Italy, and paleontologist Rodolfo Magin Casimiquela, who was a prominent Argentinian vertebrate paleontologist, was publishing articles that were probably talking about these footprints. Probably. The authors of this paper say the slab, quote, reportedly had traces of a Cretaceous bird and a hadrosaur dinosaur, and the original report by Casimiquela described them as ceratiform-like avian tracks, which he named Patagonicus venatorium, and hadrosaurid tracks named Tridigit ignis inopinatus from Rio Negro province, but they were not formally described. They were only mentioned. These tracks were photographed, drawn, described and named, but not published for decades. Quote, finally, Casimiquela formally named the Ichnotaxa, identifying the holotypes and providing diagnoses in 1996, almost 20 years later. In that paper, he mentioned that the quarry owner, Mr. Rodriguez, used slabs from his own quarries to construct the sidewalk at his residence, with several slabs bearing footprints. And there were photographs of some of these slabs, which also had footprints in them. So now, this work was in Spanish and apparently, quote, difficult to obtain, say the article. And nobody really paid much attention to it, but the authors of this paper decided that they were going to try and find these old slabs, the quarry, the sidewalks, and check all these footprints out, even if all this happened in the late 70s, when Travolta was starring in Grease. Jurassic Park-Cast fans might also find it interesting that in 1978, Michael Crichton had two movies come out, The Great Train Robbery, starring Sir Sean Connery, which was based on his book from 1975, and Coma, starring Michael Douglas. Crichton wrote the screenplays and directed both of these films. But back to ichnofossils. The authors here aim to, quote, reconstruct the circumstances surrounding these holotypes, and visited the Museo Antropológico y Histórico Jorge H. Gerhold and the original sidewalk. So, in doing so, they discovered 9 track-bearing slabs with avian footprints and invertebrate traces, and they were identified on the same sidewalk. The names Patagon ignornis and Tridigit ignis aren't official, and another goal for the authors was to perform the necessary assessments to make their status valid. All this time, Casimiquela's work on these tracks hadn't yet been formally published. So the authors concluded, until now, these ichnotaxa were little known to science because the work where they were proposed was very difficult to access. Here, we are providing all the necessary information for their scientific use. By reconstructing this history, we have been able to locate 9 new vertebrate track-bearing slabs on the sidewalk of Ingeniero Jacobacci. The hadrosaurid track Tridigit ignis inopinatus is a foot and hand track corresponding to, quote, an extremely digigrade foot with 3 functional, short, solid, blunt, subparallel digits, although one end is recurved. The name means 3-digit ichnofossil, and inopinatus means that it was unexpected in both its shape, but also to be found in the guy's sidewalk. But thanks to a paper like this, the authors say, although more studies are in need, the tracks will be the holotypes of these ichnospecies for always in a stable and objective continuity, following the criteria of the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, so it must be protected forever. Mission accomplished, I guess. Our next article stopped to look at a recurring observation in hadrosaur tails. There is a traumatic pattern found in the proximal middle part of many hadrosaur tails, and a finite element analysis revealed they are similarly broken by a, quote, diagonal pressing force. In the paper, Deciphering Causes and Behaviors, a recurrent pattern of tail injuries in hadrosaurid dinosaurs, published in iScience in November 2025, the authors evaluated a variety of hypotheses and are offering that the injured specimens represent females with mating traumas. Quote, our results indicate that the deforming stress resulted from the same dorsal force pressing upon a large area of the tail. We scrutinize all possible biological scenarios that could cause the pathological deformation of the bones. The affected area corresponds to the putative position of the cloacal opening, indicating the possibility that the dorsal force might correspond to the action of a mounting male. As such, these potential mating injuries may represent the first indirect evidence of sexual behavior in non-avian dinosaurs and a novel approach to recognize female individuals. The authors say, quote, in general, wherever there is a substantial fossil record of hadrosaurids, the same demonstrable injury pattern affecting this particular region of the tail is evident. The distal ends of the neural spines of the proximal and middle caudal vertebrae are the areas most affected, with the lower section of the spines near the vertebral centra impacted to a lesser extent. They explored a few scenarios, including whether this recurring common injury on Hadrosaurus from many samples was due to predation, muscular stress induced by rotational displacement, trampling or herding, from intraspecific sparring with other dinosaurs, or from perhaps atypical behaviors. Perhaps they were just doing some strange spine-damaging weird rolling around. But in each case, the specificity, a word I stink at pronouncing, of the injuries weren't satisfactorily explained. Why just the top of the spines? Why just above and around the hips, but not associated with other injuries? The most fitting hypothesis was that these are injuries incurred during mating. Quote, the cloaca is the only opening of the urogenital and digestive systems in certain animals, including archosaurs, like birds and crocodiles, and in dinosaurs. It is hypothesized to be positioned caudally to the distal end of the ischium. Quote, the pathological neural spines are localized to the proximal middle caudals, particularly in the area above the supposed location of the cloacal opening, and typically affected more than 5 consecutive neural spines, sometimes discontinuously. Quote, the high frequency of trauma in the proximal middle caudal neural spines, seemingly induced by vertical loading, could be related to the force caused by a mounting male pressing on the caudal dorsal midline of the female tail, inadvertently causing injury and thereby leaving pathological markers that potentially signify fossilized female dinosaurs. Which is kind of horrifying, that mating was breaking bones. That's pretty grim, but the observations are mostly found on specimens that are believed to have been adults, or at least sexually mature, and it's possible that large bulls, for lack of a better term, could have been significantly larger than females that were coming of age. Quote, the disparity in size between sexually mature young females and older males is very pronounced, making it likely that the young were injured during mating. In the case of Edmontosaurus, an early sexually mature female of about 3 years old is estimated to have been about 2 tons, while late adult individuals can weigh more than 7 tons. This imposed great pressure on the proximal dorsal region of the tail, likely causing fractures. Oof. They believe they're on the right track, though there are a few lines in the paper where they admit they're willing to listen to contrary evidence if any is presented, but this feels to them like a pretty reasonable hypothesis, and as so are excited to think that this may be a way to distinguish male and female specimens in the fossil record. Now, there is a lot in this paper. They discuss statistical assumptions, juveniles, distal vertebrae, sexual dimorphism in the fossil record, medullary bones, hypothetical mating positions, cranial ornamentation, and the absence of these injuries in other similar-sized non-hadrosaurid ornithopods. If this sounds like they've made a great leap in judgment, it's only that I haven't related everything they've considered, because the authors appear to have been very thorough. Their analysis suggests, quote, that the male mounted the female from the side, the latter probably lying on the side, with the male pressing on the apical portion of the proximal and middle caudal neural spines, causing the female to sustain a series of accidental fractures. Quote, the presence of these injured tails in adult hadrosaurids throughout their geographic and stratigraphic ranges from the Campanian to the Maastrichtian, with similar pathological lesions in the same anatomical position, plausibly may have been linked to copulation, with the injured individuals likely to be female. Different species may have engaged in different behaviors, but all needed to eat, drink, move, avoid predators, and reproduce. Based on the current state of knowledge, the only one of these activities that could feasibly result in potentially recurrent and survivable injuries is mating. As such, the identification of these injuries provides an important potential new way of inferring sex in dinosaurs, while also furthering our understanding of the dinosaur mating process.
End of messages.
All right, thanks for tuning in to Dinosaurs Lately. If you'd like to find links to the materials discussed on today's show, you can visit dinosaurslately.blogspot.com, which is a companion piece to the Dinosaurs Lately podcast. Special thanks to Alberto Reyes, Aaron Van der Reest, and Nicholas Longrich, whom to each I owe a very special thank you for their correspondence while I produced this episode. Thank you to each for their support and congenial interest in sharing their research on dinosaurs. Remember, I have a new PDF that I could give you on Ankylosaurus. If you'd like a copy, just send me an email and I'll forward it to you, no charge. And if you'd like to request a family of dinosaurs to focus on for an upcoming episode, you can drop me a line on that too. And how would you like to do that? Well, listen up. Dinosaurs Lately is a companion show to the Juras-Sick Park-Cast, the podcast where guests chat with me about Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Juras-Sick Park, and also Not That Too. And if you'd like to be a guest on that show, you can reach me at Ryan S. Rogers at gmail.com. And these podcasts are part of the Spring Chicken's banner of amateur intellectual properties, including the Spring Chicken Funny Pages, the Tomb of the Undead graphic novel, the Second Lapse graphic novelettes, The Infantry, and the worst of them all, the King Street Capers. You can find links to all that baggage in the show notes or by visiting schickens.blogspot.com. And you can connect and follow on Facebook at facebook.com/springchickencapers, on YouTube by searching for the Juras-Sick Park-Cast podcast, on Tumblr at Mr. Rogers22, on X at RogersRyan22, or on Blue Sky at RogersRyan22.bsky.social. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you feel all caught up on Hadrosauroids for now. Until next time.